follow I'm going to get this week. So thank you, Mr. McGibbon. I'm incredibly excited to be here for all kinds of reasons. This isn't my usual crowd. Alistair may say he has no business being here. I have even less. I've never been a policeman. I've never been in the military. I don't work on security. In fact, what I do is study human beings. It's what I've always done. I'm an anthropologist by training, so my background is in cultural anthropology. I'm also the child of an anthropologist, so I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s, which means I spent most of my childhood without shoes, speaking an Aboriginal language and killing things. So, excellent childhood. Did not stand me in particularly good stead when I went off to the United States, where getting water out of frogs wasn't something they cared about, and where the ability to kill things didn't impress them quite the way it should have. So that would be my usual set of apologies. Alistair is right to tip my hand. I have spent 20 years in Silicon Valley, and I'm now an academic in Canberra. That's an odd thing. What Alistair seems to forget is that I didn't actually leave my job at Intel, so I have an escape hatch. For the moment when Canberra just becomes unbearable, I'm going back to the valley because the weather is better, the coffee may be crap. But, you know, I could make that trade-off. So I thought what I would do, if it was okay with all of you, is change gears a little bit. I'm not qualified to talk about security, but what I am qualified to talk about is what people are doing with technology right now. And I think those things have implications for how we might want to think about security, and frankly, what I would think about is insecurity, which may be a better way of thinking about all of this. And I wanted to start with this quote by William Gibson, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers. And back in 2003, Gibson was being asked to predict the future. And he said something that I think is really instructive. He said, listen, it's one thing to talk about the future like it were a different country, that somehow we're going to get there eventually. But the reality is the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And what's powerful about that thought is that means if you know how to pay attention, you can actually see the future unfolding around you. And I went back and I looked in my database to see where I was in 2003 when he said that great line. And I found this photo. I took this photo, a colleague of mine and I took this photo on a train platform in Tokyo in 2003. Now, the thing about that photo is it looks like it could be taken right now. Clothes are slightly daggy, phones are crap, but you know, you all recognize that. That looks like any public place in any urban center anywhere on the planet in 2017. But in 2003, when we showed that photo to senior leaders in the Valley, they said a couple of things. They said, that's just Japan. They said, that's just Docomo, which was the Japanese telco. Like, there will never be any reason for people to use location-based services on their phone. Why would anyone do that? That just seems weird. Like, it's the Japanese, it will never take off. And we're talking about the leaders from basically all the major tech companies that we now think of as being the winners of the last 20 years, right? They just looked at that and went, nah, never gonna happen. Now, had they looked at that and gone, actually, there's something in the notion of a phone connected to a data stream that knows where it is, that knows who's around you, they might have made different decisions. So, if that's true, if the future's already here, if we could already see the moral equivalent of a train platform in Tokyo, what would it look like and what would it tell us? And I want to give you 5 examples that I think are that moment, that train platform that we ought to be looking at and not going, that's just Docomo and the Japanese, but going, oh shit, there's something we should pay attention to. And I want to start with something really banal, robotic vacuum cleaners. Because if you were going to start with something that was an existential threat, it should be a vacuum cleaner. And the reason it should be a vacuum cleaner is this happens to be the largest install base of robots on the planet currently. So when someone tells you the robots are going to kill you, what you need to know is that the robots that are coming to kill you are in fact robotic vacuum cleaners. So if you can climb stairs, you're still safe. Exactly. They're like the Daleks of Alistair's and I's youth, but not yours. So Alistair talked about Stuxnets, and he's right to talk about that. He also said that one of the things about the Internet of Things is there are 20 billion coming connected objects. Those objects are hackable, even if they're air-gapped, which was the Stuxnet's delight, was that we socially engineered a virus to find its all the way to a particular targeted machine. We know in the last 2 years we've had hacks on baby monitors, morphine dispensers in hospitals, cars. Effectively, if it has computation and a radio stack in it, it is hackable. And that's been done for malicious purposes, that's been done as graduate research projects, that's been done for shits and giggles and fun. And we have talked about the fact that having the Internet of Things increases the threat surface immeasurably. But the reality is it doesn't need to be that complicated. The CEO of iRobot this year stood on a stage in Silicon Valley in July and said, so it turns out our robotic vacuum cleaners have been mapping the inside of your house. All of it. We know, well, we know you're a grot, but we also know your furniture. We know what other pieces of computation and technology you have in your home. We know how everything is arranged and configured. We know when you do and don't move things. Oh, and by the way, our most generation of technology is going to have a camera, so we're going to have a better footprint. And the CEO says, and we think, well, we could sell that data. So you don't need to hack it, you can just buy it. And now imagine that every piece of Internet of Things, smart technology in smart homes, in smart cities, you don't need to hack it, that data is going to be available for sale. You are going to be able to buy individual pieces of that data, anonymize stacks of that data. If you wanted to decide to take over something, you don't need to hack it, you can just buy it, which means someone already has. Which means you don't need to be thinking about the classic vulnerabilities, you actually need to be thinking about the vulnerabilities of the marketplace. Now, a robotic vacuum cleaner may not seem like an existential threat, but if you knew the footprint of a building without ever having to hack anything, without ever having to break any laws, without ever having to work out whether what you knew was right or not, without leaving, in Alistair's words, a footprint they can turn back on you, if you just have to buy the data, where does that leave you? And what does that mean in terms of what becomes vulnerable, what becomes knowable, how you think about who else has information that suddenly is effectively weaponizable? You have multinational companies who are building out smart cities and smart homes and smart infrastructures. You don't need to hack them if the information's already available. And then you might want to ask who owns those companies? What are they doing with that data? Where does it sit? And how is it being made sense of? So, if everything's connected, everything's vulnerable, but if everything's connected, everything's also collected. And if it's collected, there are questions about where that collection sits and who's making sense of it and how. Second problem you have is one of the things we get told is, well, if it's connected, you can hack it. And that's absolutely true. And we think about large autonomous machinery. We were just having a conversation, Gus and I, about trucks and autonomous vehicles. And we know because we saw one earlier this year, there was a hack of a Jeep, got a navigation system, it has semi-autonomous control, it was relatively easy to hack. Hacking vehicles is a pain. You either have to work out how to insert the code, you've got to get close enough to it, you have to download something on it, you would have to take over the system in some way. It turns out there's an easier mechanism, and it's this. In July of this year, a bunch of graduate students at the University of Washington worked out that with a commercial available household printer and a stack of paper that you could buy at Office Depot, you can hack road signs and confuse autonomous vehicles. We look at that and just think it's graffiti. Someone said, you know, love stops hate. It's a reasonable piece of graffiti. We would all still recognize that that was a stop sign underneath and probably stop. We also wouldn't recognize that it was now a disrupted sign that no autonomous vehicle recognizes as saying stop. Every autonomous vehicle saw this as either not a sign or something to blow through, or at least in one instance, a change in speed limits. You don't need to hack the vehicle, you hack the infrastructure. And the hack doesn't look like a hack, because it just looks like graffiti. Scale that up. Think about every piece of autonomous technology we are being promised as a way of having safer warfare, as a way of maintaining distance, as a way of doing things at a remote angle. We are talking about having computer vision and technology that will make it easier. Yeah, guess what? 2 pieces of reflective tape on a couple of signs, and that doesn't look so easy anymore. You don't need to hack the vehicles, you hack the signs. And that looks like classic guerrilla warfare to me. It looks like classic urban guerrilla warfare. And more importantly, in some ways, it looks like something that us, as human beings, don't recognize, which makes it really quite clever and also really quite troubling. Because the only way autonomous vehicles function is with network availability and clear infrastructure. And if you can break the infrastructure that easily, where does that leave you? Then you have the next round of problems. So we have, would you like a picture of that, Alistair? Yeah, happily. Yeah, not a problem, I can tell you. Here's your stop sign. No problem. Happy to help. So you've got connected objects, you've got a hackable infrastructural system. The other piece that we often talk about what's coming is that the world we are moving into is a world that is driven by data sets. It's about who has the data. It's about how do you make that data create patterns. So think about every time someone tells you about an algorithm or about artificial intelligence or machine learning, those are all part and parcel of the same complex of technologies. Machine learning is a tool by which you take a large set of data and determine what the patterns are in it. You ask the machine to learn what is in the data. It's relatively straightforward. All an algorithm does is automate what happens when it encounters a particular set of data or a particular set of circumstances. And all artificial intelligence is, at the moment, is effectively a constellation of algorithms that can perform machine learning by themselves. It's not that tricky. And on the one hand, that is a remarkable promise. It suggests we can start to automate certain kinds of processes. It suggests we can have machinery that can analyze data at a rate we can't. And frankly, that's been part of a military and cybernetic experience for a really long time. We used computation during World War II up in Queensland with IBM's Typexes in order to break code. We have built machines that did that kind of computation for a really long time. One of the challenges, however, about all of these mechanisms is that you are using data. And the thing about data is twofold. It's always retrospective, and it's always partial. So what do I mean by that? Well, the thing about data is in order to have data, something has to have already have happened. Data is not in the future, it doesn't exist like that. And it's always partial because it's only as good as the mechanisms by which it was collected, the circumstances under which it was collected, and your capacity to know whether it accurately represents the world. Nicest example of this going wrong recently is my colleagues at Google, who to their credit have been really good about being public about their missteps. But last year, Google built a machine learning environment to create an algorithm that would label photos so we didn't have to, that would make photo search easier. That basically means you could go to Google Photos and type in the word Christmas tree and it would find all of the photos of your Christmas trees past. It would also find all the pictures of you, your kids, the tanks that you like to put your children in, whatever the thing is that is your wheelhouse, Gus, it would find you those photos. Now, in order to do that, a couple of things had to happen. Google took all the photos that they had and they hived off a percentage of them, 10%, because this is how you do this. They took their 10% and they said, okay, that 10% is representative of the whole. We are now going to introduce the machinery to that 10% and see what patterns it can learn. Much computation was involved, and ultimately the machinery learnt to recognize all kinds of things. They then said, okay, we're now going to introduce that machinery to the remaining 90% and basically go from control to broader sample. And the things it found in the 10%, it also found in the remaining 90%, and Google went, right, we're good to go. We have worked out how to label photos. We shall release this to the public. And out it went. And it took about 24 hours before someone went, so here's the thing. Have you noticed the way your photo labeling tool seems to conflate gorillas and black people? Like every time it sees an African-American face, it labels it as a gorilla. Yeah, and that's the face Google made. Oh, that's not good. Like really, oh, so not good. And so Google, to their credit, went, uh-oh, we should fix that. And so there was an intervention where they went ahead and taught the machine the difference between gorillas and black people, because that would be a good thing. But in the post-mortem, a couple of things became really clear. Number one was that the data set they used, whilst it seemed to be a full and complete data set and then 10% was representative of the 100% was not representative of the world. It was just representative of the photos that Google had at that moment in time. Because if it had been representative of the world, of all the faces in the world, it would have been about 80% of the faces would have been dark-skinned and about 20% would have been light-skinned. And the machine would not have made that mistake because it would have learnt on a completely different data set. So that was problem number one. The data was incomplete and partial. Problem number two was that the team that worked on the data didn't recognize the problem because they looked just like the data set. And so it didn't occur to them to say, hey, I don't see my face in that data, and if I did, what would it be labeled as? Oh, that's not good. So as we build out algorithms, as we use machine learning, as we move to AI, one of the critical challenges becomes, what is the nature of your data set? How do you know what's in it, and how do you know what's missing? And how do you know to ask those questions? And how do you make sure you have a team that knows that those are the right questions to ask? The classic example of getting this wrong at the moment would be from another company just down the road in the valley, from Apple, who last year released their software development kit for the Apple Watch. So basically the kit by which they encourage other people to build apps. Software development kit usually sort of sets out what the parameters are. It gives you a clear sense of what's in scope and what's out of scope. The Apple Watch, clearly a fitness wearer, tracker on your body, could do things around heart rate, combined calendar with movement, with sleep patterns, so lots of possibilities. However, there was no possibility inside the software development kit for anything that tracked fertility or menstruation, which is odd at some level. And the guy who ran the project was asked why there was no capacity for a menstruation tracker or a fertility tracker. And he smiled very sweetly at a room full of people and said, it's a niche usage. This did not go well for him. But it got all of us in the valley to thinking that the only way you could think it was a niche usage was if you didn't have any women on your team. So as you think about building teams to think about what you are doing with data, those teams need to be representative of the world you are building, not the world that you have. And you have to be willing to think about what the interventions you want to make are to get to a different reality, because the data you have will never be everything. And it will only be what you can collect or what you already have. Next problem is, so now you've got the data, you've trained the machine, it's now performing tasks. You have a second order problem that turns up, also now being experienced by my colleagues at Google, but presaged nearly 65 years ago by the man who helped create the artificial intelligence research agenda. So back in 1956, a man named McCarthy at Dartmouth College in the United States kicked off the initiative around AI that we still live with. But one of the things he said back then in 56 was that if we can make machines think and we can teach them to reason, they will ultimately build a system of beliefs. And in 56, everyone went, yeah, nah. And it just kind of filtered away from the conversation about AI. This year, again, my colleagues at Google, who are very good about being public about what they're doing, which makes them a good example, my colleagues at Google took a different set of machine learning tools and taught the machinery to play Go, so a Chinese strategy game. The experiment was called AlphaGo. They took all the people who were the best in the world at playing AlphaGo, they took all the rule books, they took all the possible moves, they found a machine and they went, argh. And the machine was trained by AlphaGo experts, it played lots of games. This went on for quite some time. It took about a month, which is quite long in current calculation terms. And at the end of that month, the machine knew how to play AlphaGo. It could reliably beat the experts, but not always. And everyone went, yeah, okay. And Google took it one step further. They took AlphaGo Mark 1, and they asked it, if you can imagine asking a computational object, they tasked AlphaGo 1 with training up the next generation, AlphaGo 2. And they said, here you go, teach it everything you know, and let's see what happens. It took about 48 hours before AlphaGo 2 knew how to play Go. It could beat AlphaGo 1, and more to the point and more importantly, it could beat every Go champion around. And most interestingly, it beat them with moves no one had ever seen before. They weren't illegal. They were perfectly comporting to the system of the world, but no Go champion had ever seen anything like it. And more importantly, they can't work out how it got there. They have no idea, if you want to pardon this as a metaphor, they have no idea what's going on inside its head. It's worked out the rules, it's playing within them, but it is not playing a game any of them recognize. So imagine a world in which we take data, we train machinery, the machinery learns a set of rules and ways of being and doing that no longer resemble our own. How will we regulate that? How will we teach the machinery to explain to us how it got there? Because at the moment, no algorithm knows how to unbox itself. It doesn't know how to tell you why it's making certain kinds of connections, because we haven't privileged that kind of thing right now. So effectively, they're learning, and they have no way of telling you what they've learned, and they have no way of explaining how they got to that moment in time. And then think about how terrifying that would be if you imagine what you have fed it is rules and encounters of every war we've ever had, someone else's military strategy. It is now intuiting strategies that you will follow on a battlefield, but you don't know why. We have an object we can't scrutinize, yet we operate in a world where there are international regulations about the rules of war and the rules of engagement. How will all of that unfold? It is unclear. But we knew this was coming back in '56. And we knew that if you trained machinery, it would ultimately start to create its own worldviews. And I'm not talking here about Skynet going live and killing us all, but what I am talking about, it'll kill Alistair, let's be clear, but not the rest of us. What I am talking about is machinery that will create its own structural systems, because we're asking it to, and because it is learning in a way that humans don't learn. So unsurprisingly, what it ends up with is a completely different thing. All right, so last but no means least, and this one would be my homage to Mr. McGibbon, because I knew he would be here. So you can hack infrastructure, you have algorithms, you have data. Maybe there's a different kind of thing that will happen here, and there are two examples that I think are really quite telling. On September 11th, 2014, a chemical plant blew up in Louisiana. This is the footage of that explosion on YouTube with ISIS claiming credit. Twitter made noise, Facebook made noise, text messages were sent to citizens in Louisiana and neighboring American states. It took a number of hours before it became clear that there was no fire, there had been no explosion, ISIS wasn't claiming credit for anything, and that what had in fact happened was an elaborate hoax. Someone had created B-reel news video, someone had created a real news video with a news anchor standing up in front of a burning building. Someone had an entire army of bots on Twitter pushing out news. Someone had worked out how to send the moral equivalent of an Amber Alert out on the American phone system. And someone had taken this footage, posted it to Facebook, and used all of it to create a page on Wikipedia about the explosion. So on the one hand, an elaborate hoax. On the other hand, I think you can argue that it's more than that. It was about how do you hack reality? Because again, you don't need to hack the objects. You can just change the perception. Now, to Alistair's point, there is an open debate about the current impact of hacking on the 2016 American election. This happened in 2014. This was performed by an offshoot of the Russian government in a place called, oh God, what is it called? Not the Bear, not the Bunker. Oh, I can't think of the building. It's by all accounts, a state-supported digital organization. At the time, in 2014, none of us could work out what it was about. In 2015, we were still speculating about what it was a dry run for. I think it's safe to say we may know what it was a dry run for. Now, that took an enormous amount of work. That took weeks of effort, that took coordinated activity, that took video, that took actors, that took twitbots, the whole 9 yards. That was a lot of work. As of 3 weeks ago, the most popular restaurant in London, the hardest one to get into, #1 on TripAdvisor, is a place called The Shed at Dulwich. It has remarkable reviews, it has an exquisite web page, the food appears to be glorious. You cannot get a reservation there for love nor God, not even if you're the Prime Minister's special advisor on cybersecurity. Not even then, sorry. Because it turns out the place doesn't exist. A computer science student with some spare time and a burner phone decided for fun to make a restaurant on the internet just to see if he could. He built a website, because those are easy enough to do. He got a throwaway phone. He put the number on the website. He told everyone they couldn't get a reservation. He asked all of his buddies to write reviews. Other people wrote reviews about not being able to get in. And it took a surprisingly short amount of time for this restaurant to go from obscurity to the #1 restaurant on TripAdvisor in London, without ever existing. So the reality is there is an inordinate amount of technology that can be used in threat-based activity. But the reality is, too, that despite the fact that it upsets my security friends no end, because they just say that the weakest link in the security chain is human beings, and they're not wrong, there are still 7 billion of us on the planet. And restaurants in Dulwich and chemical plants in Louisiana, and the ways in which we get our news and our information and our notions of the world are in fact easier to spoof than they have ever been. We know that for many, many years there were entire efforts engaged in various forms of this kind of work. It's incredibly old-fashioned at one level to basically tell stories that aren't true. What's amazing here is the scale at which they can operate and the very little amount of effort you need to have to put into them. So as we think about what the future is that's already all around us, what's it about? It's about connected objects, but it's also about the people that own them and the data that goes with them. It's about infrastructure that you can hack, not necessarily devices. It's about the data that you're training things on, but it's also about the fact that when push comes to ultimate shove, we're all humans in this system, and as humans, we are remarkably fallible. So with that, I want to say thank you and stop.